We just finished our unit on the history of physiology, and we're going to wrap it up looking at a microscopic investigation of how animal cells cooperate to deliver oxygen to all body cells. We learned about William Harvey's experiments to help us understand what the heart was doing and that the blood was circulating in the body, and others helped us understand the lungs were involved in gas exchange. So using this diagram, when we inhale, oxygen is being absorbed into the blood, the capillaries surrounding the air sacs, and then of course the left side of the heart, the left ventricle, is going to pump that oxygen-rich blood all around to the body, and at various locations within the capillaries, the red blood cells will give up their oxygen to the surrounding body cells. Of course, the blood will pick up carbon dioxide waste as well, and now the blue blood will travel back to the right side of the heart, and the right side of the heart will pump that blood up through the lungs, where we can exhale carbon dioxide and pick up a new load of oxygen. So the circulatory system guarantees that all body cells get a constant supply of oxygen. But why do cells need oxygen? Here you're looking at 3 cheek cells from a human being. Cells are the basic units of life. They're the smallest units that are living. And large organisms like animals and plants are multicellular. So these are 3 cheek cells from a human being. Now each cell has a boundary called the cell membrane, a flexible boundary, and it controls what goes in and out of the cell. The fluid inside the cell is called the cytoplasm, and the darkly stained oval is the nucleus, where DNA is located. Now we'll be learning much more about cells, but for now we're just going to say that there's some complex chemistry going on within cells. We'll call it the chemistry of life. And for that chemistry of life to occur, the cell has to constantly import resources from its environment, food. And food molecules are a source of building materials and energy. And this is what's necessary to maintain the chemistry of life within the cell. Of course, all this chemistry does produce waste, which has to be exported out of the cell. If waste builds up in the cell, it interferes with the chemistry of life. Now, the chemistry that releases energy from food requires oxygen. So here's our basic first level approach to this question: why do cells need oxygen? Because there's some chemistry, some really important chemistry that is producing energy from our food that requires oxygen. Back in the late 1800s, Richard Altman, using microscopes and various stains, identified lots of these tiny little sausage-shaped structures within animal cells, and we now know them to be mitochondria. Now, mitochondria perform important chemical reactions that break down food molecules to produce chemical energy for the cell. They are the power plants of the cell. The chemistry of mitochondria requires oxygen. All large and complex cells have mitochondria to power their operations. So now we're getting more specific. Why do cells need oxygen? Because there's important chemistry going on in the mitochondria that requires oxygen. And we'll be learning that the mitochondria are breaking down food molecules to harness the energy that is stored in those food molecules. So mitochondria can produce useful energy from food, and that food for a typical body cell like ours is glucose. Glucose is a sugar, and it must be delivered to all of our body cells so that our cells can have energy. The energy is produced in mitochondria, and the chemistry in the mitochondria requires oxygen. You've seen this picture before. This would be a capillary somewhere in the body. The red blood cells are giving up their cargo of oxygen to the body cells, and notice the oxygen is going into these red structures. These would be the mitochondria. Also notice that carbon dioxide waste is produced by the mitochondria. That's going to enter the blood, and the blue blood will be taken back to the right side of the heart and pumped through the lungs so we can exhale the carbon dioxide. So that's our story then. All of our body cells need oxygen. The lungs pick up the oxygen. The circulatory system delivers the oxygen. Now, the circulatory system, as we've seen under the microscope, is composed of organs that are made of cells. Each type of cell has a function, a purpose, a job to do. The structure of cells and how they are arranged into organs is related to the function of the cells and organs. When cells perform their jobs well, they end up helping other cells in the body. Together, cells cooperate to meet the needs of all cells in the body. Animals are a team of cells. So now it's time to take a look at some of these cells under the microscope, and we'll see how their structure is related to their function, and then how they all work together to achieve this goal of making sure every body cell has what it needs to survive. Now we'll notice something about the cells that we see under the microscope. They are specialized, so they have different appearances. They have different structures. And we'll see how they, in fact, are sort of cooperating. Cells have special jobs, and when each of them does their job well, it helps the other cells as well. So they're cooperating to meet the needs of all body cells. Let's take a look top left here, muscle cells. This is cardiac muscle under the microscope. The function of these cardiac muscle cells is to generate force. Of course, that's the contracting force that will squeeze the ventricle to a smaller volume and expel blood. Blood cells, their function is to carry oxygen. These little disc-shaped structures are the red blood cells. By the way, there's a white blood cell there, another one there. Of course, arteries and veins are hollow tubes. This will be a cross-section through an artery, and here we see the wall of the vein. So their structure, the hollow tube, is related to the function. Blood is going to travel through these tubes. And here, over here in the bottom left, we see the rings of lung cells. These would be air sacs, but we've sliced through a hollow sphere, so we get rings of lung cells. So these would be the air sacs. So when we inhale, air would be filling up these spaces here, and oxygen in that air would be entering the capillaries surrounding the air sacs. So let's take a look at them one at a time. Muscle cells. Now the picture on the left here, these pictures are skeletal muscles. Here's lower power, here's higher power, but they're similar to cardiac muscles. Skeletal muscle cells, you can see they're kind of cylindrical, long cylindrical cells. They curiously have multiple nuclei. Most body cells have one nucleus per cell. They have multiple, but that's their structure. Now, when a muscle cell contracts, it just shortens its length. So whatever's attached to it on the end will experience a force. Take a look over here on the right. So here's the muscle. It's attached to some bones, right? And so when the muscle cells contract, it's going to move the limb. So the muscle cell structure is long, thin, cylindrical cell. The function, contract to generate force on whatever is attached to their ends. Here's a beautiful microscope slide showing muscle cells, the red cylindrical objects, and then we see a nerve here branching into multiple synapses. So it's at the synapse where the nerve is going to trigger the contraction of the muscle cell. So neurotransmitters will be released and the muscle cell responds with contraction. Now this would be voluntary muscles. So this would be skeletal muscles. The heart muscles are intrinsically contracting to their own rhythm. That's a different story. But this was just such a beautiful slide that I wanted to show it to you. So again, we really see down here a nice view of a synapse, except this is the neuromuscular junction. It's not a synapse between two neurons. It's a synapse between a neuron and a muscle cell. In the case of the heart, then, the cardiac muscle cells form the walls of these big, powerful pumping chambers. And the septum is this thick muscular wall shared by the right and left ventricles. So when cardiac muscle cells contract, the pumping chamber is squeezed to a smaller volume, thus pushing blood out of the chamber. So notice then, cardiac muscle cells are not attached to bones, they're attached to other muscle cells, and when all those muscle cells contract, the whole chamber gets smaller. Now it is true that there are nerves going to the heart, but those nerves do not make the heart beat, but they regulate the rate of the heartbeat. Let's take a look at the artery and vein. Here we have a nice cross section through part of an organism, part of an animal, and we see this thick arterial wall here. And then the wall of the vein is smaller. It doesn't have a muscle layer to the extent that the artery does. This pinker tissue, these are muscle cells. And that allows the artery to sort of control the diameter of the artery and help regulate blood flow to different parts of the body, as well as giving it a bit more elasticity. So the hollow structure of the artery and the vein, of course, is related to their function because they're carrying blood. Here we see a scanning electron microscope of a blood vessel here running alongside some muscle cells. This was a slide that we used recently. Again, we see the thick wall of the artery and the thinner wall of the vein. The blood in the arteries is under higher pressure. The blood in the veins is under lower pressure. Now on the left here, we see our diagram sort of these tiny blood vessels that connect arteries and veins. We call them capillaries. And capillaries are very, very small indeed. In fact, down in this picture, you can see the diameter of a capillary is not much larger than the diameter of a red blood cell. So red blood cells have to sort of move through capillaries in single, single file fashion. Over here, we see red blood cells. Now, red blood cells have a structure. They're small, rounded discs. And that makes it so they can easily pass through small capillaries. Of course, the function is to temporarily bind oxygen in the lungs for transport to the body cells. Now, I'm about to show you a video that shows blood moving through blood vessels in the tail of a fish. So here's the circulatory system of a fish over here. We have the heart, by the way. The fish doesn't have lungs, so the heart has one ventricle that's pumping blood through the gills, where oxygen is moving from the water into the blood through the gill tissue. And here we have red blood, so oxygen-rich blood going to all parts of the fish's body. There are capillaries then where the oxygen is going to leave the red blood cells and go to body cells, and then the blue blood is going to come back to the heart. Let's take a look at what a fish tail looks like under the microscope. All right, in some of these scenes then, you can see that some of these blood vessels are very small and red blood cells are moving single file through those tiny capillaries. Under the microscope, we also saw slides where we had a mix of blood. So up top left here, we have human and frog blood mixed together. And there's a notable difference between the red blood cells of these two species. The frog blood cells, red blood cells, have a nucleus that's stained purple here. They're larger and the nucleus is present. Mammal blood cells, ours included, we have smaller red blood cells and they don't have a nucleus. So as these red blood cells were maturing, they ejected the nucleus to make more room for hemoglobin proteins to carry oxygen. So mammal red blood cells are smaller. They don't have a nucleus like frog blood cells. Of course, the blood also has other kinds of cells, white blood cells. White blood cells are serving an entirely different function. They're part of the immune system. So they patrol our body looking for foreign invaders. We'll study that a little later. Let's take a look at what human blood looks like under the microscope. Now the odd shapes, so the kind of spiky appearance of some of these red blood cells has to do with some chemicals on the slide itself is causing the red blood cells to kind of change their shape a little bit. All right, here we have a white blood cell, and we're going to fast forward a little bit. And here's a white blood cell under 1000 magnification, and it's crawling around the slide, surrounded by red blood cells. So again, this kind of cell would be part of our immune system. If it encounters a bacteria, it will swallow it up. If it encounters a cell that is injured or infected with a virus or some other kind of abnormality, the immune system, composed of cells like this, can detect that and kill a cell if it's been infected with a virus, or it can just kind of sweep up any foreign invaders that it might encounter in our body. All right, finally then, let's take a look at lung tissue under the microscope. Low power here, higher power, higher power. And so again, we're looking at a thin slice through hollow air sacs, so we're going to get rings of tissue. Here we see a diagram of the lungs up here at the top right, and again, they're hollow chambers surrounded by capillaries, but to prepare the slide, you make a thin slice through these hollow chambers, you're going to see rings of lung cells. Incidentally, we say this is lung tissue. When we say tissue, it means that the object is composed of one kind of cell, so lung tissue. But lungs have other kinds of tissues as well. After all, there are capillaries there. So there are other tissues in the lung. So the lung is an organ composed of several tissues. Lung cells make up the air sacs. That would be one tissue. Here we see a nice microscope slide where we can see some of the other elements of the lung. The bronchiole would be one of the airways, a small airway that is going to end in multiple air sacs. And here we see part of a blood vessel that was bringing blood to and from the lungs. In our cartoon, we have the cross section of the air sac here. So these are lung cells forming the wall of this air sac. And then we have a capillary here, the wall of the capillary, and then red blood cells moving through the capillary. Of course, they're blue as they come from the body. They've got high load of carbon dioxide and low oxygen content. The carbon dioxide moves into the space in the air sac for exhalation, and the oxygen is going to move across the wall of the air sac through the wall of the capillary into the red blood cell, changing its color. Now these red blood cells are filled with oxygen to be carried around to the body. So what we've got is the cooperation of four kinds of cells here. Lung cells make air sacs, red blood cells carry oxygen, heart muscle cells pump the blood, and the blood travels to all parts of the body in vessels made from cells. So here's a cross section of the artery and the vein. All of these kinds of cells are cooperating so that every body cell gets a constant supply of oxygen. Of course, body cells don't just need oxygen, they need other things too. They need food. In this case, it's glucose and other nutrients, but glucose is the main energy molecule for our cells. Well, where does glucose come from? Of course, we eat food. So in the intestines, we're going to digest our food, and important nutrients will be absorbed into the blood, including glucose. So the intestines will deliver glucose into the blood, and now the blood is going to deliver glucose to the body cells just as the blood delivers oxygen to the body cells. So here we see a capillary somewhere. Glucose in the blood is going to move from the blood into the body cells just as oxygen does. In fact, both of these are going to be involved in mitochondria. Mitochondria, basically their job is to extract all the energy out of glucose, and that chemistry requires oxygen. So here's our mitochondria. We have glucose is chock full of energy in these chemical bonds, and the mitochondria, to simplify it, is going to break a lot of all these chemical bonds, and energy will be released and harnessed in a way that is useful for the cell, and that chemistry requires oxygen. In fact, the energy of glucose is going to be stored in special molecules called ATP, and this is a more usable form of energy for the cell. Now, this chemistry in the mitochondria produces waste. These are familiar molecules, carbon dioxide and water. Now, The water can just kind of go out into the cytoplasm, but we can also then export water out of our bodies. The carbon dioxide must be exhaled in the lungs. So all the chemistry in the mitochondria is producing carbon dioxide, which enters the blood. Now it's the blue blood. It's already given up oxygen. Now it's going to be filled with carbon dioxide waste, and that will have to go back to the right side of the heart, and the right side of the heart will pump it through the lungs so we can exhale. So what we've learned then is that our circulatory system, our respiratory system, and our digestive system are all sort of cooperating to meet the needs of all of our body cells. The respiratory system is getting oxygen into the blood. Our cells need oxygen. The digestive system is getting glucose into the blood. Our cells need glucose. The mitochondria within our body cells are going to be doing important chemistry to get the energy out of our food molecules, glucose, and that chemistry requires oxygen. Of course, there are other nutrients that we absorb into the blood as well. The blood is going to be delivering everything that cells need to stay alive.